Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So you'll remember a few months ago, I had Jonathan and Uday on to talk about their fare integration report for the Toronto region. Now, as you probably know, if you're on the Discord server or on Twitter, or if you watched my breakdown video on YouTube, the Toronto Regional Board of Trade has now released a new report on regional rail. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to ask some questions, we're going to discuss a bit what's in the report, why the report, lots of interesting stuff. So without further ado, let's get into it. So sort of my first question, and I think the question a lot of my viewers would have, is why regional rail and kind of why this plan? Why did the Toronto Regional Board of Trade want to come out with a report on this topic? Maybe Jonathan, you can answer that.
So this is actually part of a series of reports that we've been doing. This is the second in the series. The first in the series looked at kind of the big picture of regional transit integration. And that's really the goal of the whole report series, to recognize that we're a single social and economic unit as a region, but that we don't really have a transit system that matches that. It's easy to drive across municipal boundaries, but when you're taking transit, between agencies or between municipalities, it can get pretty complicated and pretty slow, pretty inconvenient, pretty expensive. So we're trying to talk about, over this whole series, how we can build the kind of integrated transit system for the entire region that will put us on a par or better than our peer cities around the world. So like I said, the first report looked at the big picture, which is how do you get a fare structure and an administrative structure that can handle regional transit integration without completely eliminating local autonomy around things like planning local bus routes and employing bus drivers, that kind of thing. So the second and third report are really diving into the details of implementing the service needed to deliver good transit across the region. So this one is looking at kind of the long distance cross-regional transit system, which is regional rail, and then the next will look kind of we can call it last mile, but there's more to it than that. But that's about getting the local transit right in the region. And then the fourth report is going to look at the challenges that we face with delivering infrastructure, with costs and other issues. So, why this report? Well, GO and Metrolinx are doing some really exciting work around expanding GO and adding service, midday service, off-peak service, counter-peak direction service. There are a lot of procurements going on in the background, including one very big one and a few other ones. And we're really excited about that. There haven't been a lot of details about a release. Metrolinx did a business case for regional rail, and it was very favorable, as I think it should be by any reasonable measure. This is an amazing value for money project. But what we wanted to do was really fill in some of the details, drawing from what you might want to call best practices or successful implementations around the world, places where regional rail has been implemented for the last 50 to 100 years, to see what's worked for them and see how we can bring that back to the Toronto region and let the public know about what some of these details could be and what the best path to go to maximize the benefit from the project. And why now? Well, I think COVID, as much as anything, makes this especially urgent. So over 90% of GO's rail riders before the pandemic began or ended their trip at Union Station. Well, I'm not saying that the financial district is going to go away, because it's not. It's going to come back. But that market is not as much of a sure thing as it used to be. And I think that regardless of that, we have to think about how this amazing resource of rail network that we have could be used for serving all kinds of trips throughout the region, the way the subway does, for example, rather than just really focusing in on that peak period commuter market. And a lot of that is about improving the service on regional rail. It's also about integrating it within a broader transit network. so that people can start their journey here, take the bus to the train here, take the train, and then take, the LRT on the other end, whatever it might be. The bulk of people going to most GO stations park and ride today. And that's fine. Obviously, there's always going to be some park and ride. But the problem with that is that the lots fill up at 8 a.m. So if you're talking about adding a whole bunch of service at noon or 1 p.m., well, those stations might as well not be there from a park and ride standpoint because the lot is completely full. So you need to figure out a better way to get people to stations. And to some extent, that is development around the stations, maybe developing some of those parking lots. But the bulk of those people, just like the TTC subway, are going to get there by connecting local transit services. So, figuring out that integrated picture is key. And, given the context of COVID, given the incredible resources that we have in terms of a rail network, and also, given the urgency of addressing the housing crisis, given our rapid growth in population, now's the time we really need to get moving on this. And this is, from an infrastructure standpoint, about as high a priority as you can get. So this really is an incredibly valuable project, but as much as anything, this report is about figuring out how to raise its profile in the public consciousness a little bit. I've lived in a lot of cities around the world, and I've never lived in a place where people sort of around the dinner table talk more about transit. But a lot of the oxygen in these transit debates have been around, the usual things that we're all very familiar with: what to do in Scarborough, et cetera. And meanwhile, a project as incredibly, region spanning, region transforming as regional rail has kind of gone under the radar, and we wanted to do something about that. So that was one of our key motivations.
So for the next question, I think it's worth actually asking, what is regional rail? And when kind of designing this report and designing a proposal, what cities do you look at? Like, where do you think does regional rail right? What cities, what regions? Yeah.
So one of the things we tried to do in the report is draw this contrast between commuter rail and regional rail. And, you can quibble with the terminology, but what matters is the distinction. So commuter rail is what we have in a lot of North America, where it's a premium fare. It's oriented to get people to the downtown core at rush hour, in the rush hour direction. It's about getting people to park their car at the station and ride the train to get downtown and then come home in the evening. It's a very traditional model in North America, and it works well for what it does, but it is limited in the types of trips that it is useful for. Regional rail is very different. It's about getting to the station by bus or other local transit, or even building development around the station. It's about trains that go all the time in both directions, all day, weekends, weekdays, whatever. It's about using the existing rail corridors almost like a subway line, but a subway line that stretches way out to the regional edge, so that it's relevant for everybody in the region, and that might also allow faster travel than would be possible with local transit alone. So, and it's also about having fares that are fully integrated with the local transit system. So it's quite a stark distinction when you look at it that way, but which is why those two terms that are often used kind of interchangeably, we really want to draw that stark distinction. And, in terms of what places inspired us and what places we looked at, we tried to cast a pretty wide net. I can tell you, to some extent, this has been a bit of a personal journey for me, because I've been pretty fascinated by regional rail for a very, very long time. As a teenager, I spent several summers in Munich, and Munich in a lot of ways has a system that it's a bit smaller than Toronto as a city, but it has a transit system that we really could aspire to. It has this incredible S-Bahn network that goes to all parts of the region. When I was older, I lived in Berlin for a while, and it has bigger city. It has an even more extensive S-Bahn network, very frequent, that really functions as the backbone of the local and regional transit system. And people use it interchangeably. And this is true in Munich as well. People use it interchangeably with the U-Bahn or the subway that they have. So that was something that really impressed me, really struck me, and I thought that this was a model that was something that we should be emulating here. And when I was in school, I wrote a paper on the history of the Paris RER, and that story was also very interesting to me. And Paris's RER is an incredibly high capacity system that in many ways could also function as a model for this. And obviously in Asian countries, particularly Japan, they have incredible regional networks they're kind of a whole nother level from anything anywhere else. But certainly they show you the sheer potential of this mode. They have lines that move 1 million plus people a day. So this is an almost unlimited potential as a technology, if you want to call it a technology. So that was something that we looked at and that has always inspired me.
So on my end, I have not lived in Germany previously, but I grew up in New York City, where we have 3 very large, relatively well-used commuter railroads, which very much operate in that classical 9-to-5 model. And growing up, in Brooklyn, not too far from the Atlantic branch of the Long Island Railroad, I was always sort of frustrated and curious about the absence of trains and the irregularity of trains on that network, which certainly I think informed my interest and my belief in the potential of this mode of transit development to help cities in the US and here in Toronto as well.
And I think the Atlantic branch is actually one of those perfect examples of a line where ridership is very low. So you might draw the conclusion, oh, well, demand is low. There's no demand for transit in that corridor. Well, obviously that's ridiculous. Brooklyn is just about the densest place in North America. There's millions of people every day who ride transit, in and through Brooklyn. And yet this line, which is a perfectly good transit line running on an important corridor in Brooklyn, is barely used. Why? Well, it's because the service level is so limited. The fare is not integrated with local transit, and it operates as a bit of an orphan line. And that's because it's very much on that commuter model. And if the Atlantic branch were rebuilt as regional rail, it would likely have incredibly high ridership. But we can't let the current demand be considered to be the fixed and permanent demand.
And I think it may even be worth pointing out that in a lot of cases, we don't need to rebuild all that much to enable that regional rail service, right? Do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, it's an incredibly cost-effective investment, as the corridors and to some degree the tracks that you already, you need to run the service are already present. Rebuilding these corridors at today's transit construction costs would cost many, many, many billions of dollars, likely in the tens or hundreds of billions. And I'm speaking about Toronto now again. We have all these assets at our disposal, and it is really up to us to decide exactly how intensively we want to use them, how much we want to build on these extraordinarily strong legacy corridors in helping to shape the future of transit in the region.
So to Uday's point, this really is an incredible asset that we have sitting there that we're not really using to its full potential. These lines, when you think about the Kitchener corridor, the Lakeshore corridor, the Stouffville corridor, all of these lines are in places where if you built a subway, that there would be lots and lots of ridership. The area along the Kitchener corridor is certainly no less dense than the area along the Spadina corridor or the Bloor Danforth, or even much of Yonge. And yet it has a fraction of the ridership of any of those lines. Why? Because it has a fraction of the service, and the fares are considerably higher. These are high density areas within the city of Toronto and even outside the city of Toronto. If you go to the Markham on the other side of Steeles, it's no less dense than Scarborough on the other side of Steeles. So there is huge density and huge potential. And when you look at the scale of the asset that we have, I talked about Munich and Paris. Well, Munich has 2 tracks going across the center of the city. All their S-Bahn lines have to crowd into 2 tracks. Paris has a number of different corridors they've built over decades across the center of the city. They total 8 tracks. Well, Toronto, just going through Union Station, the corridor there has 10 tracks already. So we've got more infrastructure than Paris has built over the last 50 years, and we're not using it to 1/10 of its potential.
So the next thing I kind of want to ask is with regard to freight. I think every time I talk about GO Transit or just rail in North America in general that isn't on a subway or light rail system, people bring up that there's these interactions with freight, and I think the first part of my question would be kind of how do we manage that? How can we provide a good rail service when you do have to consider those interactions with freight? But also, I think it's kind of something that garnered some attention in the report is that there is the Milton line on as one of the corridors, and there's mention of potentially using the Midtown Toronto line. And so I think it's interesting if maybe you can talk about why these are things that are possible and how you think interactions between freight and passenger traffic can work.
So yeah, that's a really good question, and freight is incredibly important. There's no question about it that any regional rail improvement cannot be at the expense of freight rail movement. I always like to say, Canadian freight railways are a real, Canadian success story. Canada moves more ton kilometers of freight by rail than the entire European Union. So there's an enormous amount of freight traffic on some of these lines, and there's no question that we should shunt that to the side for local passenger service. These are the freight main lines of 2 of the biggest freight railways in the world. So don't get me wrong, 100% that is a priority. However, the majority of lines in the Toronto Regional Rail Network are not part of the main freight network of the freight railways. They're already owned by Metrolinx. The Stouffville corridor, the Barrie corridor, the Lakeshore corridor from Burlington to Oshawa, and the Kitchener corridor from Union as far as Bramalea and actually beyond Georgetown to Kitchener. All of those are already owned by Metrolinx and have very, very, very limited freight traffic. So on those routes, freight interactions really aren't that much of a challenge. Obviously, the freight railways that used to own those tracks have the rights to continue to operate, but you're not dealing with dozens of trains a day on those routes. So designing for that is much, much less of a challenge. The 2 corridors where absolutely there are freight interactions that matter are the Kitchener corridor between Bramalea and Georgetown, where the CN's bypass track kind of uses it as a route to get west before going back south again to Burlington, and then CT's Milton corridor, which is part of the Galt sub, their main line, which continues across North Toronto and up into Scarborough. So both of these lines have tremendous value as part of a regional rail network. I think there's a decent case to be made that the Milton corridor has, of all of the different routes radiating from central Toronto, probably, maybe the most potential if service were equal. There are a number of different possible solutions, whether it's laying separate passenger and freight tracks in the same corridor, whether it's some sort of broader rearrangement of freight traffic in the region, and that's something that would have to be worked out with the freight railways. But I think that we need to put this into the context of the value of these corridors. These corridors, if we were to build them from scratch at rapid transit or even light rail construction costs, would be tens of billions of dollars to replicate. These are incredibly valuable corridors, and so if it costs some money to achieve this rearrangement or capacity addition or any kind of arrangement with the freight railways, that's a pretty reasonable investment when you take into context that these are tens of kilometers long corridors that connect right from Malvern through Agincourt, Leaside, Central Toronto. And out into Central Etobicoke and Mississauga, for example, and Milton on the Milton corridor. So there's incredible value there. So that's something that is worth investing if the freight railways can find a way to make it work.
So I think it's worth kind of bringing up, is there precedent for this type of infrastructure, having maybe sharing a corridor or that sort of thing with freight and passenger in North America?
There definitely is, including here in Toronto. I think one of the perfect examples is between Pickering and Oshawa. Metrolinx owns what's called the GO sub, and that's been there since the 1980s. That is part of CN's main freight rail route, which that corridor continues to be used that way. But GO Transit built a separate pair of tracks just north of CN's route that are exclusively used by GO trains, and that's why to this day, GO can operate as much service as it wants to Oshawa.
And I'll add that in New Jersey, there is a very, very busy shared corridor between freight and passenger trains where currently everybody runs on the same pair of tracks. But there's a proposal in the New Jersey Transit Capital Plan to run, and this is the Raritan Valley line between a point south of Roselle Park and Newark. So to run the freight trains on one pair of tracks and then build a second pair of tracks for passenger trains to reduce the interference and allow both freight carriers and the passenger operator to realize much more capacity with much less interference. So this really is a precedented move, and one that I think globally is recognized as a pretty valuable investment.
I think my next question is sort of around branching. And when we look at a lot of these regional rail lines, they are good, they have good locations, but some of them, like Milton, for example, which we talked about previously, they sort of miss the core, the core areas of our various cities. So, for example, the Milton line travels south of Square One area. What do you guys think about that? I think you kind of talk about it a bit in the report, so if you want to elaborate, that'd be fantastic.
So one of the things we talk about in the report is this potential to build a sort of diversion of the Milton line through Mississauga City Center. Currently there is a reserved transit corridor in the Highway 403 right-of-way, and the Milton corridor gets close to that reservation at one end, and it would be within the realm of possibility, especially in a world where we have more frequent service, to sort of increase the return on our investment, to build a diversion there, to bring trains through Mississauga City Center and realize that increased access to jobs, access to residences, and also increased access to bus connections, because Mississauga City Center is a really important bus hub for that part of the region. Mississauga City Center is, one of the ones we mentioned in the report, but it certainly is not the only possibility in this world. I think another thing we talk about is the Orangeville-Brampton Railway. So that's a corridor that branches off the Milton line a bit beyond this potential diversion and goes up through Brampton and eventually ends up in Orangeville. The corridor is currently threatened. There's talk of sort of abandonment or cessation of freight use. But we believe that given the fact that it goes near and through very large hubs in Brampton and in Mississauga, there could be a really strong case for using it to increase access within that part of the region and further interconnect some of the 905 with high frequency, high quality transit.
So yeah, just to build on that, these are not GO trains. I think that's the first thing to remember. These are much smaller, nimbler, faster, accelerating, higher performing trains. So they're much better able to take, more creative routes, stop more frequently. You could build a short underground segment without breaking the bank the way that you would if you tried to run an underground segment with a GO train. So that's something that's worth remembering. And because they're running so much more frequently, adding infrastructure makes sense. It doesn't make sense to build expensive infrastructure for 6 trains a day, but it certainly makes sense for a train every 10 minutes. I think another thing, when you look at Mississauga City Center, one of the things worth remembering is that the purpose of regional rail is not necessarily just to serve specific destinations that happen to be next to the rail track. It's about being the backbone of the local transit systems all across the region. So you look at Mississauga City Center, which is the hub of the My Way bus service for a lot of reasons, because it is itself a major destination. There's also the interchange with the transitway there. One of the problems you have to remember is that if you're making a lot of riders take the bus to Mississauga City Center, then transfer to the bus or to the LRT when that's complete to get to Cooksville Station, and then to go from Cooksville to their ultimate destination across the region, you're now forcing people to make 2 transfers, and that really reduces reliability. It reduces and it increases travel time and harms the competitiveness of transit. So that's something that is always important to remember. If we can, make sure that the bus hubs and the regional rail stations are in the same place, you'll really make the system more usable for a lot of people. Another place that's perfect for a diversion, of course, is Pearson Airport. That's been talked about a number of times, and Pearson Airport, or the area around the airport, is a huge employment area, and it's a great place for kind of a Western GTA transit hub. So again, diverting regional rail there also makes a lot of sense. But one of the things where I think we need to change the mentality around how we look at this stuff is greenfields. We are doing greenfield development, whether we like it or not. There's a lot of it that's happening, and one of the problems is that greenfield development, on farmland, tends to be very auto-oriented. Why? Because it gets built after a highway gets built there, rather than and then transit is added, maybe years later, is an infrequent bus at first. One option is to, instead of building things that way, why not build a branch to a major greenfield development? I can think of Queensville, which is north of Newmarket. That there's a major development going on there, very close to the Barrie GO line. You could build a branch off the Barrie GO line for next to nothing, or even just preserve the corridor for a branch, because it's just farmland now. But if you try and shoehorn through a rail line after the development's already built, it's going to cost you billions of dollars. So that kind of long-term planning and integration of greenfield development planning or brownfield development planning with rail network planning really is a great way to bring transit in from the beginning, make transit really time competitive, and build infrastructure way more cheaply. The only reason we were able to build the 407 was because we had that right of way preserved for decades and decades and decades from when that area was farmland. We should do the same thing for transit.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty interesting point, because I was thinking of the Barrie line because there is a ton of growth in York region, and I think what Calgary shows you is that if you do pre-plan these corridors, that's what enabled Calgary to build a lot of its light rail system so inexpensively, is when they built, major streets and other, other infrastructure. They planned around the light rail coming in the future, and that helped them save money down the road. So it's important. Yeah. So with the way you guys have planned your infrastructure, your network, your service, it seems like you do have a certain philosophy, but I'd like you to kind of expand on what that is. What is the philosophy that you use to design everything?
So there were a few different things that fed into this, including some guiding principles. But one of the planning philosophies that we really wanted to emphasize was one that comes from the German-speaking world, which is called organization before technology before concrete, basically. The idea is that first, the cheapest way to solve problems and the most effective way to solve problems when you can is by fixing your organization. So fixing the way that you design the service, the way that you administer the service, the way that you interact with the customer to make it easier to use. So oftentimes you can increase capacity and improve service without having to change anything physical, simply by changing your operating practices. Then when you need to, the best thing to invest in is better technology. So that's, more modern trains, upgraded signaling systems, better public information systems. All those kinds of things will go a long way to improving the operations of your system, again, without having to build any physical infrastructure. And only after you've kind of exhausted the potential of those first two should you actually start to build physical infrastructure. And I think when you look at the Toronto system that way, you realize that we really don't need that much physical infrastructure. A few flyovers here and there, a few extra tracks here and there, electrification, obviously, but that kind of maybe could fit under technology. And then the big bottleneck that is Union Station. And we actually we had the report reviewed by, especially the technical aspects, by some very experienced Swiss rail engineers, and really tried to learn from them as much as we could about how things are done in Switzerland and this kind of an operation, because Switzerland is certainly a real model for this stuff.
So I think the next kind of major thing to talk about is Union Station. You guys dedicate a lot of time to talking about it in the report. It's currently being rebuilt to some extent, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on what Union should look like in the future.
Yeah, so Union is sort of the core of the Trillium network, though the plan very much is about sort of making it possible to use regional rail for other trips that don't involve Union Station. It is nevertheless true that Union Station will remain a massively important and extremely busy hub for the network, and thus has to be designed really well so it doesn't constrain capacity. So we approached this with a few sort of broad design ideas in mind. So I think first among those is absolutely maximizing passenger circulation at Union Station itself. Currently, the station has narrow, low platforms with narrow staircases. In our proposal, we essentially look towards widening those platforms and reducing the number of tracks and widening the staircases so that people can get on and off of trains as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible, so trains don't get held in the station for an unnecessarily long period of time. This, of course, increases capacity, increases travel speeds, et cetera, and has really good ramifications for the rest of the network. But of course, Union Station alone, we believe is not sufficient to handle existing loads, and much less load that would come with all the increased service that we're proposing. So for that reason, as well as to serve the expanding developments that sort of are stretching along the lakeshore in Toronto right now, we've proposed also adding a number of other stations in the corridor at Spadina, Sherbourne, and Cherry. These would connect with the areas around them and also take some pressure off of the Union Station itself, much in the way that, say, Redfern Station in Sydney does, or that some of the other RER stations in Paris take loads off of Châtelet-Les Halles. So together, we believe these investments, as well as simplifying the actual track infrastructure at Union, as enabled by our sort of operating plan and sort of simplified timetable for these services, together these investments would realize a large capacity dividend and allow us to run very frequent service across the entire Trillium network without having to build more tunnels or an underground station at Union, as has been previously discussed. Yeah, and beyond just the capacity benefits, there's also some pretty significant speed benefits as well. Currently, GO trains travel quite slowly through that corridor, given the complexity of the tracks in the area. One significant benefit of our simplified routing arrangement and consequently simplified track arrangement is that trains would be able to move through the corridor much more quickly. Alongside that, of course, are reliability benefits. So as Jonathan previously mentioned, there are a few places where you'd want to build flyovers to sort of deconflict operations and stop trains from delaying one another as they sort of cross in front of each other. We propose a couple of important flyovers in the Union Station rail corridor that would help in this regard. So there's a few that we propose for the Milton line, and these would essentially make it possible to send trains through the area without them having to cross in front of other trains, which increases reliability, makes it much more easy to adhere to schedule, and makes everyone's trip faster and more predictable. And so I think that is also just a critically important part of this plan, and is also a really real benefit of this more sort of timetable-centric planning approach. With a clearer sense of the service you're going to operate, you can make these more parameterized and sort of more targeted investments that realize larger impacts, simply because the operating plan is more consistent and more well-defined as you're designing your infrastructure.
So I think my next question is, and I think this is probably something a lot of people ask, why brand it separately? Why call it Trillium? We have this good brand and Go. What's the kind of purpose of that?
So I think that's the key point. We have a really, really strong and positive brand with Go. But I think the thing is that when people think about Go in this region, they think about travel to the 905. They think about commuting to Union Station. They think about travel within the 905. They think about premium fares. They think about park and ride. All of these things are the exact opposite of what we're going for with regional rail. We want people to think of it as a viable option within the 416. We want people to think about it as being integrated with local transit. with the same fare structure and the kind of train that you could use as one leg on a broader journey. We want people to be thinking about it as, you take the bus to the station, not as much park and ride. So when you're talking about something that is completely different from what we have today, but that try to have the same brand, I think that understandably leads to some confusion. So I think the best approach would be to create, maybe some kind of a sub-brand. And I think the perfect parallel with that is Viva on York Region Transit. They created the Viva sub-brand. It's still part of YRT, but everyone knows that when they're on a Viva route, the buses come a bit more often. They're going to have priority, nicer stations, nicer buses, that kind of thing. So, it emphasizes that different level of service. So, we thought that this was something that made sense when designing this kind of a plan.
So I think an interesting point to bring up that sort of interacts with your plans is the Ontario line. I think it's really exciting that we're expanding the subway in Toronto, and something that I personally find really interesting about the Ontario line is how, compared to the Relief line, it's really tightly integrated with the regional rail network. And so maybe you guys can talk a bit about how you see your proposal kind of interfacing with the Ontario line.
So yeah, the Ontario line really does fit in pretty well with regional rail. And, I think this is something that GO recognized, or Metrolinx recognized, when they were planning the Ontario line project. They really wanted to emphasize connections at Exhibition and at East Harbour. The Ontario line, when it was first being planned, I was a bit, I've been obsessed with and working on the Relief line for many, many, many years. And I was always a pretty firm believer that the Ontario line needed to be further south, because that's where the concentration of development is, south of Queen Street. But and studies in the past have all suggested that as well. But I think actually when you put it in context of having a regional rail service that functions effectively like a subway across the bottom of downtown, having another rapid transit line at kind of the northern edge of downtown at Queen makes a lot of sense. Suddenly we start to see the makings of a New York or London style, kind of grid of rapid transit lines. One at just below Front, one at Queen, and then one up at Bloor, all serving east-west trips. And considering those connections at East Harbour and Exhibition, it's a really great way of relieving Union Station first and foremost for commute trips, but also just allowing people to get closer to their destination. So if you're coming in from Mississauga on the Lakeshore line, you can get off at Exhibition and ride the Ontario line if you're going to the Eaton Centre or whatever. Or if you're coming down from Thorncliffe Park, but you actually want to go to a job near the waterfront, you can switch at East Harbour to the regional rail system, and then get off at Union or Spadina and have a much closer walk to the waterfront. So it really does make us for the first time have a real network of rapid transit lines, and that would really be very exciting.
So I think one of my personal favorite parts of the report where you had these cool maps that essentially show how far you could travel from a certain point in a given period of time. I think it was an hour or 30 minutes, something like that. Could you just tell us a bit more about that? How does regional rail change travel times in the region?
Yeah, so part of this project was actually writing a timetable for the entire Trillium network to simulate our projected travel times and to inform these access analyses. So I have on my computer a copy of sort of a mock timetable for the whole network. And what that allows us to do is then, run these maps. And I think what these maps drive home is, first of all, the benefits of all the improvements we talk about. That's everything from fare integration to, electric multiple unit train sets to, regularized service patterns to frequent service. All of these things sum up to quite a large, dividend to, where you can go and how quickly you can get there. And I think, speaking more broadly, this is, in the end of the day, Trillium and all transit is, or perhaps should be, about increasing access, whether that be access to employers or access to employees, access to friends, access to activities, access to destinations. And we hope these maps drive home just how transformative the Trillium network could be for access. Whether you're someone trying to get from Mississauga to Markham or from downtown Toronto to Brampton, the Trillium network could really help quicken that commute or that trip and open up a whole new world of opportunities for you and for the region in what you can do with transit. So yeah, I think again, we hope these maps can demonstrate that.
So it was great being able to ask you guys some questions about the report. I thought it was excellent. Thanks so much for coming on and talking to me. And I think I and my audience looks forward to having you guys back on to talk about your next report on last mile and local transit, which I think could be very enlightening. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.